Welcome, everyone. We'll be talking about floodplain basics today, and I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the Minnesota State Floodplain Manager and work statewide. And my coworkers, Gary Bennett and Ricky Hoffman, will be helping with logistics and watching chat and those kinds of things. So appreciate them being here today to help us. Then moving on, this is what we'll be talking about today is floodplain management basics. We'll talk a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program, what the roles are for communities. We'll cover some basic definitions and basic permitting requirements. We'll talk a little bit about Minnesota's floodplain versus shoreland management regulations. And we'll have a quick update about flood insurance basics at the end. So, and as I mentioned, we'll stick around. If you have other questions, we'll be trying to answer those. But this is a national program. It was started in 1968 that Congress passed these laws, and the three main parts of the regulations and the law at the national level was to identify those higher risk areas. So that's the FEMA mapping part of the program, to have some national minimum development standards, though they are regulated at the local level, and to make flood insurance available. Flood insurance was really spotty. It was hard for private insurers to handle the risk because their policies tend to be localized in one area. You have one big flood, and it was hard for the companies to stay in business. So they made flood insurance available nationally to help spread out that risk, and they made it mandatory in 1973 if you've got a federally backed loan. Then more recently, mitigation got added as a big part of the floodplain management approach at the national level. I mentioned that the national program, the regulations were put in place in 1968. In 1969, Minnesota adopted the State Floodplain Management Act, and we, in that, said that the DNR will be the coordinating agency, and it's the state's responsibility to work with communities to get them enrolled in the program, to enforce some minimum standards, provide technical advice and assistance. We are required by law to review and approve ordinances, the floodplain management ordinances. And as a state, we provide assistance during disaster situations, though that's mainly with the Homeland Security Emergency Management Division. And in 1987, we started a state-level flood hazard mitigation grant program, which is pretty unusual to have the nice program that we have at the state level. We won't get into any details about that today, but we do have other trainings available talking more about the grant program. So we'll start a little bit with the roles and responsibilities. And this is a cartoon I saw in my local newspaper, decades ago. And I think it does show what people's perception is that we're pointing at all these different agencies, but we really do all have very specific roles, and we work together to enforce those regulations and help people to understand what their regulations are in that community that impact any particular property owners. So the zoning authority, who is the city or the county for the unincorporated areas, and in some cases in Minnesota, we have townships that are the zoning authority. You guys are definitely the most critical part of those responsibilities. You're the ones that adopt an ordinance, get enrolled in the national program, and administer and enforce those regulations. At the state level, we do have oversight responsibility. We do a lot of technical assistance and training. As I mentioned, we approve ordinances, and we do have mapping staff, and they're doing more of the data development and mapping than in past years. And in these more recent years, we've got a lot of effort being done at the state level. But in general, we're coordinating between the communities and FEMA, and also with the other agencies in the state and watersheds. Mentioning watersheds, they're really important in the state. They've got, some have regulatory authority and have regulations that overlap with the state and local regulations, and often have some better mapping and data available. And then FEMA, they are overseeing the National Flood Insurance Program. They're the ones that officially enroll communities in the program. They can suspend communities if they don't properly enforce things and don't get things back in line after they've had some problems there. But they also have a very big role in the mapping and producing the maps and the data and doing the final approvals of those maps that we use for enforcement of the regulations. I need to mention that our area hydrologists, our DNR area hydrologists, they each have a portion of the state, and they're your first contact for many projects, for specific projects. And they're the ones that do issue our state level public water work permits and water appropriation permits, but they also coordinate on the land use programs like floodplain management, shoreland management, wild and scenic rivers, and those things. So they're, if you don't know your area hydrologist, and especially if you're a local community staff person, then you want to get to know who your area hydro is. So, talking a little bit about what's considered a community for the FEMA program, for the National Flood Insurance Program. It's whoever that zoning authority is. So in Minnesota, within city boundaries, the city's always the zoning authority. And then for the unincorporated portions of the county is the zoning authority. Except in Hennepin, Ramsey, and Anoka, they're completely divided into cities or townships that do their own zoning. Townships in Minnesota do have the authority to be the zoning authority. Maybe a couple dozen of the townships in the state have chosen to take on that authority. So they will be considered the zoning authority if they have a DNR approved floodplain ordinance. And then, of course, the tribes, they can join the program, but they would work directly with FEMA as sovereign entities there. But we're happy to work with anyone with the tribal governments there. So the National Flood Insurance Program is a partnership. The community, when they get in the program, they agree to adopt an ordinance and keep that current. They do have to go through the adoption or the application process, and you just have to do that once. You don't have to do any kind of annual renewal things, but you are agreeing to enforce that ordinance and to keep records. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about several times throughout the training today. And we get into more detail in our upcoming training on Floodplain Administration 101. But some of the benefits of being in the National Flood Insurance Program is that if you're in the program, flood insurance, that federally backed flood insurance, is available to anyone within your community. Whether they're in the floodplain or not, they can choose to buy flood insurance. And you do have to be in the NFIP to be eligible for some of the types of post-disaster assistance, like most of the permanent public assistance that becomes available if there's been a federal disaster declared. And then some of the mitigation grants and that are only available if the community is in the program. But one of the biggest benefits is you're helping to reduce that risk in your community. You're helping to prevent people from building in those higher risk areas and be more resilient over time. We do have all of our counties that have the zoning authority are in the program. Many of our cities are, but we do have a couple 300 little cities that are not in the program. And if you work with those cities, we'd encourage them to get in the program. We try to make the process to get enrolled as easy as possible and provide recommended language and examples of the notices they would need to run and those kinds of things. And we do have, as I mentioned, a couple dozen townships that are the zoning authority, and many of them are in the program. FEMA does have the official community status book that they list the communities that are in the National Flood Insurance Program. It shows the communities alphabetically and then shows the county and other information. It does show the current effective map date and the date that they got enrolled in the regular program, or if they're still in the emergency program. And you'll see this NSFHA and say, well, what date is that for my map? And it means that there's no special flood hazard area mapped in that community, and it's officially considered all the lower risk zone. On the old maps, it's zone C. If it's got the E here in the date that they got in the program, that means that they're in the emergency program. We have maybe 20 communities left in the state that are still in the emergency program. They're in counties that don't have the updated digital maps in general. There's one other piece of information in here. It's talking about CRS, and CRS is the community rating system, and that's a program that you can get in separately, and you document that you're doing higher standards, you're doing better outreach, you're doing some mitigation projects, you get points, and the more points you get, the better class that you're in. And we don't have very many in Minnesota that are in CRS, but if that's something you're interested in learning more about, we'd be happy to meet with you and talk about that program. In this example, we're showing Montevideo and Moorhead, who are in the program, and their class and the discount that anybody with flood insurance in their community gets is based on their class. The lower the class number, the higher the discount that anybody with flood insurance in that community gets. The community status book does also list the communities that have mapped floodplain that are not in the National Flood Insurance Program here in the last few pages of that community status book. I do sometimes refer to this as the naughty list, and we would encourage any communities on that list to get enrolled in the program. And we'll get into more detail on the FEMA map, but just to get some terminology and some ideas of what we're talking about up front here. This is an example of an older paper map, but the darker shaded area is the area that's regulated that we'll be talking about mainly today. And on the old maps, this is what it looks like. And the medium risk area is this lighter gray area. The medium risk area is usually the 500-year floodplain, or the 0.2% annual chance flood. But it can be areas where they've been protected by a flood control project and they've gone through an accreditation process, or it can be places where it's the 1% or the 100-year flood, but it's less than a foot deep, or it's draining less than a square mile. And then the unshaded areas are on the old map. It might be shown as zone C, and then on the newer of the maps, it's called zone X. And that's the areas where they're not showing any mapped risk, but there still can be local risk. Urban stormwater is definitely a bigger concern as time goes on. And so there still can be a flooding risk, but FEMA really focuses on the riverine areas and the lake areas. And then we'll be talking about floodway and flood fringe a bit more, but on these old maps, these hatched areas are the floodway, where we have very restrictive zoning, and the areas that are the dark gray that are not hatched is called the flood fringe. On the newer maps, the digital maps, this is what those different zones look like. We have that high risk zone, which would be the light blue areas and the cross-hatched areas. This is the floodway on the newer maps, and the flood fringe is the light blue. The medium risk, again, that usually the 500-year floodplain is that kind of brownish color, and our lower risk area, again, is the unshaded areas. On the newer maps, the higher risk area is called Zone A, might have an AE, which means that there's elevations on the FEMA maps. Or the medium risk area is called a shaded Zone X, and the low risk area is also a Zone X, but it's called the unshaded area. When we're looking at data for the FEMA maps, in an area where they've got detailed information, they usually calculate the 10-year, 50-year, 100, and the 500-year, which we call the 10% flood, the 2% annual flood, the 1% annual flood, and the 0.2% annual flood. So we've got data for these different frequencies, but the regulatory level that we're talking about is that 1%. And on some of the newer mapping, we also have the 25-year or the 4% annual chance flood, and something called the 100-year plus, the 1% annual chance, the upper end of the confidence level there for calculating that 100-year. So again, we'll be talking about that regulated area, but we do use that data from the other frequencies for other design purposes, like for septic systems, that 10-year, for critical facilities, especially we want to see them above the 500-year or outside the 500-year, some of those kinds of things. For 50-year, we'll use for clearance when you're getting public water work permits, a lot of other good reasons to be having that data available. And I've already used several of these terms, but they're basically synonymous. The 1% annual chance flood, the 100-year flood. We try to not use the term 100-year flood because people have a tendency to think, I've had a big flood, I've had my 100-year flood, I'm good for another 99 years. And that's not the way it works. It really is, you've got a chance every year of having that big flood or a bigger flood than what is shown on the maps. Another term we'll be using here is base flood elevation, which is what FEMA refers to that 100-year flood level as frequently. If you look in Minnesota law, it'll talk about the regional flood, which is the same thing. And when you're talking to lenders or insurance agents, they'll tend to refer to it as the special flood hazard area, where the flood insurance is mandatory if you've got a building in or touching the floodplain and they've got a federally backed loan. And sometimes we'll just refer to it as the high flood risk area. We'll talk about a couple of basic definitions, and then we'll go into talking more about some of the regulations. So right from the beginning with this program, folks realize that not all of floodplains have the same level of risk. And so when FEMA, or the feds at the time, that was actually before FEMA existed, but when the feds were looking at what should the regulations include, they said, you know, we recognize that if you're right next to that river, you're going to have greater velocity, greater depths of flooding, definitely higher risk than someone who's maybe on the very edge of a floodplain. Maybe you're in a backwater area, or you're on like the very edge of the Mississippi River where it's very shallow. So they decided that we're going to treat the higher risk part of the floodplain differently. And that's the area where we're not going to allow most types of building. And in Minnesota regulations, we say no new buildings can be in this higher risk area. So what they did was they had the engineers model what the floodplain would be at that time, or whenever they were doing the initial modeling. And then they would say, okay, what part of this river should be set aside and left for that flow to go through during times of flooding? Because we know that it's going to be going certainly along the river and some of those near overbank areas. Where's it high velocity? Where is it deeper? What area do we need to save for the floodwaters to go through? So like on this example, we've got a road along here. We know there might be some culverts connecting it. So it might be getting flooded over here, but it's more of a backwater. It's not, you're not going to have the flows through this area so much. So that's an area that they might say, this can be the flood fringe. And then over here, we might have a little community. They want to be able to allow some of the building expansion of that community. So they drew along there and said, we'd like this to be able to be our flood fringe where we're going to be allowed to continue to have filling and development. And then the engineers would simulate that flood fringe was all filled in, that was going to be developed, and then run their model again. And if you take up some of that space with it being filled, it does cause what's left in the floodplain to have a higher flood level. The national standard says that filling can't cause more than a foot of rise. And in Minnesota, right from the beginning, since we adopted our rules and statutes back in 69 and 70, we limited it to half a foot and also have wording that says you cannot increase flood damage potential with whatever increase you have. So if there's current buildings in or right next to the floodplain, you can't cause any increase that would touch those buildings. So it might, in an area that's already developed, that means you can't have any rise. And in more rural areas where you've got some space to work, you can have up to that half a foot of rise. So sometimes it was an iterative process to make sure that it was under that half a foot and that you weren't impacting any existing buildings. So mentioned the base flood elevation is that what the FEMA flood elevation is, and for the federal regulations, your lowest floor for any new buildings or substantially improved or damaged buildings is at that lowest floor, including the basement, has to be at the base flood elevation or the 1% annual chance flood. In Minnesota, right from the beginning, they said, well, gee, we're allowing up to another half a foot of increase when we're establishing that flood fringe area that can be filled in. So that's really what the flood level would be, is that flood elevation plus any increase. And then we add a foot of freeboard, which is a safety factor. So we add those three elevations together, and we call that our regulatory flood protection elevation, our RFPE. For a little while, the freeboard requirement went away, but it became mandatory again after the 1997 state law change. And those of you who have been around in the state for a while will remember that 1997 was a really big flood along in the Red River Valley, and a lot of damage. And the legislator said, we're spending a lot of money rebuilding here. We want this freeboard back in there so that we don't have that kind of damage in the future. Now, a freeboard, as I said, it's a safety factor. It takes into account the fact that when the engineers are doing the modeling, they're assuming no log jams, no ice jams, that water's all flowing nicely through the bridges and the culverts, no obstructions, which we know isn't reality. Other kinds of uncertainties, our modeling's gotten better over the years, but especially in the beginning, we had more uncertainty in our topography information and our data that we were using to develop the models, and also taking into account that there might be future development that hadn't been realized in the modeling. So here's an example. This is in Benson, out in western part of the state, where they've got this railroad bridge here and a major road here. They get these huge chunks of ice during certain springs as the melt is going on, and you can imagine that that would cause a rise in the flood elevations when you have that kind of obstruction due to that ice. And same concept with log jams and things like that. So another important definition for our floodplain regulation is the lowest floor. When we're talking about that the lowest floor has to meet that minimum elevation, that regulatory flood protection elevation, we're talking about the walking surface of the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area. So that includes basements, that includes crawl spaces, and again, it's measured at the walking surface there. And a basement in the federal regulations is any area that's below ground on all sides. And basically, residential basements are not permitted based on the federal minimum requirements, except we've got a handful of communities all in the Red River Valley area where they got a special basement exception, where they are allowed to have some basements if they meet certain dry flood proofing requirements. The basement, you might have just a partial below grade. That's still considered a basement, even if we wouldn't necessarily call it a basement. We might call it like a split level or a lookout level, but that's still considered a basement. The other thing we run into is sometimes people will call it a utility space or mechanical space, or they'll give it some other name. They won't call it a basement or a crawl space, but that is still a basement according to those FEMA definitions. So that's still your lowest floor, and the walking surface, the top of that floor is what needs to be meeting the minimum elevations. And just a reminder that, again, they're prohibited for residential buildings. For non-residential buildings, they can do dry flood proofing and meet certain higher standards like that. So say we're looking at this building, and this is the regulatory flood protection elevation. Would that be meeting the minimum elevation? Let you think for a second. But this is a split level, so that's a floor there, that's a floor, and you do have a lookout situation here. So that would not be legal if it was within a floodplain. That example actually was my house when we were putting on an addition, so it's not illegally built, but it's a reminder that in those situations, we're looking at that lowest floor. I also put this in here because some of our watersheds and some of our local governments, they might have maybe a higher freeboard. Maybe they require a 2-foot or a 3-foot freeboard, but they're looking at the lowest point of entry. And so in a situation like this, they might be meeting that watershed requirement, but they're not meeting your local ordinance, because our federal state requirements are based on that lowest floor, not on the lowest opening. So summary here, the key requirements for a building, especially a residential building, are that you're not filling in the floodway and the building's not in the floodway. You're having your lowest floor meet that regulatory flood protection elevation. And then if it's a residential building, they do have to have 15 foot of fill around the building. That can be a foot lower than that lowest floor. And it can be a more gradual slope, or it could come down a little quicker. You might see sometimes some little retaining walls or something. But at this point, 15 feet out from the building, it's supposed to be at your flood elevation, including that stage increase. So if you had this situation where it was in the floodplain, they put some fill, but then they put in a crawl space below the regulatory flood protection elevation, would that be allowed? And the answer is no. There should not be any crawl spaces or utility spaces or whatever you call that area below that regulatory flood protection elevation. Your lowest floor needs to be above that. One other term that sometimes confuses people is the ordinary high. People hear the high water in that ordinary high water level definition, and they think that's the same as the flood elevation. And the ordinary high is the official boundary of public waters in Minnesota, and we use it for shoreland setbacks and for determining if the work is going on below that ordinary high and they need to follow the public water work permit requirements. But the flood elevation is usually a couple feet higher. And on rivers, it can be 10 or 20 feet higher. But on lakes, it's typically in the range of a couple feet higher than the ordinary high. The ordinary high is based on physical evidence. And it's most commonly where that transition is between predominantly aquatic and predominantly terrestrial vegetation. And we have crews, our survey crews that go out and do ordinary high determinations on the lakes in particular, and they set that elevation based on that physical evidence. And they might look at wash lines and stain lines and things like that also. Whereas the floodplain is based on calculations, on modeling, analysis, those kinds of things. For instance, I could go out to a lake and look at the vegetation and say, well, this is about where the ordinary high is. But I cannot go out and just point to where the floodplain is going to be, because that's taking into account how big is that watershed, how much storage is there in that watershed, what kind of soils do you have, what kind of slopes do you have. A lot of other factors go into determining what that flood risk is on that basin. And here's the official definition from the state statute there for the ordinary high water level. On rivers, watercourses, the ordinary high is defined as the top of the bank of the channel. And of course, the floodplain usually goes into that overbank area. So it's definitely in a higher, wider area. So the ordinary high, it's established over a longer period of time based on that physical evidence. As I mentioned, it's used for our shoreland management setbacks. Whereas that 1% annual chance flood, the floodwaters, they'll be more temporary. They're not usually leaving any long-term evidence. And it's really based on modeling and analysis. So where do the floodplain regulations apply? FEMA maps are developed, and FEMA requires that the ordinance apply to all the areas covered by the FEMA maps. So here's an example where this pinkish area is the delineation of what the FEMA map officially shows in that area. So the community that's adopted the maps in this area, they're regulating all of this area. And so this site here, even though I can see based on those 2-foot contours that they're high, that is in the FEMA mapped area, so you're ensuring that that building meets your floodplain regulations. In this case, they could even still put in a basement because they're really high, and their lowest floor would still be meeting your minimum elevations. But in this area here, the FEMA map, especially some of those older maps, they did not follow the actual ground elevations very closely compared to the flood elevations. So you will have areas like this that might be missing on the FEMA maps, but our state law, the rules that were developed back in 1970 said, if an area that's adjacent to that FEMA mapped area is below the flood elevation, your ordinance is still regulating that area. So the person who's in this area that now with our LiDAR, we can see more often if an area is low and adjacent to the floodplain. It's been a requirement again all along, but it was much harder to see those situations, back before we had LiDAR. The other reminder is that we've got many areas where we're overlapping with floodplain and the shoreland regs. The shoreland district in Minnesota, that goes 1,000 feet from those lakes that are classified, and at least 300 feet from any water courses, public water courses. And if there is a map floodplain, it goes to the edge of that map floodplain. So remember that even if they're outside of the floodplain, which along the lake is pretty common to see, that they still have minimum elevations within that entire shoreland district. And what the shoreland rules say is within the whole shoreland district that if you know the flood elevation, you're going to use that regulatory flood protection elevation, which is that 100-year plus a foot. Most lakes won't have a stage increase. So it's usually just the 100-year plus a foot. But if you don't have that calculated area, so here's your 100-year, you've got a foot, that's your minimum elevation. But if you don't have that flood elevation calculated, the shoreline rules say you use our ordinary high water level or the highest known water level, whichever's higher. So whichever's higher of the ordinary high or the highest known water level, you add 3 feet, and that's your minimum elevation. So I'm going to talk briefly about the main zoning requirements. And this cartoon here says, building in a floodplain is like pitching your tent on a highway when there are no cars coming. Here's the road, we know where the cars are coming, and similar with the floodplain. We've got the map floodplain where we're most likely to have the flooding. We know that, it's on a map. We're going to make sure that we don't put buildings in that high flood risk area. So let's say the community had zoning, but it was before they had any flood information. So they had some residential, some commercial area. Along comes the FEMA maps that gets overlaid in this zoning. So in addition to looking at whether it's a residential or commercial zone, we're also looking at this overlay district, this floodplain district. And in some areas, we have the floodway calculated and mapped on there. So we actually have a separate zone because in the floodway, we regulate the kinds of building that can go on. And then in the flood fringe, you'll continue to have that overlay. You'll have some standards you need to meet if you're in the floodplain, but you'll have your underlying standards if you're in residential, commercial, whatever zones there. So again, on these old maps, we're showing the floodway with the hatching, the flood fringe. On the newer maps, this is what that looks like. So the main requirements are that most structures are going to be prohibited, most kinds of buildings. Definitely any residential buildings, primary buildings will be prohibited. There are a few accessories to open space uses that can be allowed, but most uses are not allowed in the floodway. Then if you're in the floodway and you're putting in a new road or you're doing grading for a trail or a parking lot or something like that, you must show that grading that you're doing there, that you're not obstructing the flow. You're not increasing the flood levels for anybody. So you have to do some analysis of that proposed grading and show it won't increase the flood levels. If you're in the flood fringe area, whatever's allowed in your underlying zoning is allowed, but there will be minimum elevations for that lowest floor, usually based on filling, but we have some alternative elevation methods people can use. They could be up on stilts or up on a perimeter wall that allows flows through. And if it's a residential building, that requires a conditional use permit. And you can do floodproofing, anchoring for some other types of development, but there'll also be restrictions on what you're storing in those areas or in those buildings. You can't have any hazardous materials or anything that's injurious to plants, animals, and people stored in the floodplain. Many of our floodplains are called Zone A's, where they haven't done a detailed study and haven't figured out where the floodway is. So from a zoning perspective, you're treating that whole area as floodway until it is modeled or shown otherwise. On lakes, we do have some optional wording in our model ordinance that as long as it's not part of an actual flowing system, it's not near the tributaries or outlets, it's not in a flowing area next to the lake, then you can say that the area below the ordinary high is the floodway, the area above the ordinary high is flood fringe, where you can allow development. And that's taking into account that we have setbacks. We don't allow, we only allow minimal disturbance in the shore impact zone, that area closest to the lake or the river. We do have a training coming up in January if you want to learn more about dealing with some A zones and figuring out floodway versus flood fringe with some accepted methods. But in general, we're going to assume the full potential stage increase. So we're going to add the foot for the freeboard and half a foot for stage increase in any of these A zones where we haven't calculated where the floodway is yet. FEMA defines development very broadly, and they say that you have to have permits for any form of development in your floodplain. That's what your ordinance says, and that comes from federal regulations. And their definition of development is very broad. Of course, it includes buildings, but it also includes any kind of other man-made structure, and grading, mining, dredging, filling, all those things are considered development, and you need to have some kind of permit. It might be a building permit for the buildings if you've got state building code. If it's not a building, you're going to give them some other kind of permit. Most communities will call them a floodplain permit or a land alteration permit or a zoning permit. Whatever you use, that's up to you. But the couple of exceptions would be if you're getting a DNR public water permit for a project that's mainly below the ordinary high. If they're getting that public water permit, you don't have to have a separate permit at the local level. But if you've got other higher standards, other regulations, you may still be giving them a permit. You can waive fees or have reduced fees if it's something that you wouldn't require a permit if it was outside the floodplain. And a reminder that a local permit's needed if work's in a public water, but it's deregulated. So for instance, let's go to this slide. You'll have cases where here's the public water course. So if someone wanted to be doing something at this crossing, they would need a DNR permit. But this area here, this is part of the floodplain. This yellow is the floodplain in this graphic. And that's not a public water, so they wouldn't need a DNR permit. So a local permit will be required to show that they're meeting those floodplain regulations. The other reminder is that the DNR regulations don't require a permit for those crossings and grading in the areas that drain less than 5 square miles, or if it's a replacement at the same size, type, and elevation. So it might be that they don't need a DNR permit, but they will need your local permit because they have to have a permit for that work. When is no permit needed? If it's like a tent that's up for maybe a local community event, or like they'll put up something sometimes in the parking lots seasonally to sell plants or those kinds of things. Those are temporary structures that don't need a permit. Or recreational vehicles that are travel ready. They're licensed to go on the road, they have functioning wheels, they've got a quick disconnect. Those don't have to have a permit as long as they meet that travel ready requirement. But you do have to watch those RVs where people essentially turn them into their cabin. That's like their second home, they end up adding decks, or sometimes they'll even put things over that RV. That is not travel ready. You can't do that in the floodplain. Other small things from some FEMA guidance, they talk about routine maintenance. If you're painting, you don't need a permit. If you're just continuing to do farming in that area, if it's something insignificant like planting a garden or putting up a mailbox, here showing just a few bags of filling that you're going to do in your garden area. That's considered insignificant, the flagpole. But most other things are going to require a permit. So how about this? In-ground pools definitely need a permit and need to meet shoreline setbacks, but this is showing a more temporary kind of pool. That doesn't need a floodplain permit, but it might. I know that some communities require permits for even those seasonal little pools if they're over a certain depth. And we did have an article about pools in the floodplain in one of our past Water Talk newsletters. But how about this? How about fences? They do need permits. And that's something that FEMA's really started emphasizing. Oh, gee, about 20 years ago, they made sure that we had language in our model ordinance making it clear that fences need permits. Now, we did get an exemption. We've got statute that defines farm fences that are basically the posts and the wire, that those don't need a floodplain permit. But these solid kinds of fences, including chain link fences, do need a permit. They need to be anchored, have flood resistant materials, and if they're in a floodway, they need to do the no-rise analysis, make sure that it's not blocking that flow and causing increases in flood levels. And if they're in an A zone where we haven't figured out the floodway, they need to show that it doesn't cause more than that allowable rise, that half a foot, and that any rise won't touch any existing buildings. And people say, well, but gee, chain link fences, they've got all these openings. Well, when you have a flood, they catch all the debris. This is the river's over here. This fence is perpendicular to the flow. It caught all this debris. You can see that the force of the flooding actually knocked this fence over. It might be a little hard to see, but that got knocked over, and it's collected all this mainly leaf debris and little sticks. It's not big, huge chunks of anything. That's enough debris that it effectively is like a solid barrier to the flood flows. So again, in the floodway, we're going to allow very limited uses. This is actually a trail along the Mississippi River. Trails are allowed as long as they show that no rise for whatever grading they did, but you still can have some damage. They just had this light post, but a big log came along, knocked it over there. So you can't say there won't be any damage with the things that are allowed, but these are things that have less damage than, certainly we don't want building a home in that area. Now in that flood fringe, you can have houses, you can have primary buildings, but they do need to meet that minimum elevation, that regulatory flood protection elevation. We showed that lowest floor has got to be at the regulatory flood protection elevation. The lowest ground next to the house needs to be the flood elevation with the stage increase, and residential buildings need that 15 foot of fill coming out there for some extra protection. And here we've got the boats here so that people can get there during floods, basically. So we talked about this a little earlier, but this is the fill version to bring it into compliance. For small accessory structures, those that are up to 600 square feet, they can be wet flood proofed. And I want to mention that we did just earlier this year update our model ordinance. It used to say 576 square feet or a 24 by 24 garage, and even older ones said 500 square feet. The FEMA guidance that came out a couple years ago allowed up to 600 square feet, so we've updated that in our model ordinance. But they do need to have flood-resistant materials up to the regulatory flood protection elevation. They need to have any utilities, which should just be electric. You shouldn't you have plumbing in there, I suspect that you're not just using it for parking and storage, and you can only use this wet floodproofing option if it's for parking or storage. You need to have it anchored, and they have to have automatic openings on at least two sides of the building. And that vent is to help equalize the pressure, because as you get water built up on the side of the house, it's going to put pressure against that wall. You want to equalize that pressure. This is what happens if you don't equalize that pressure. And unfortunately, there's way too many places in the state where this has happened in the past. Those vents need to be no more than a foot above the ground, and you need a square inch of opening for every square foot enclosed. And there are some engineered options, and like this example, the company certifies that as equivalent to 200 square inches of opening. So those are nice when you want to have an insulated space also. There is this guide for calculating the area, the net opening of these non-engineered ones. So documentation that the work is compliant is mandatory. So permits need to, after they have done the building, you need to require that they submit that as-built information. And for wet floodproof buildings, they don't necessarily need a surveyor to get out there, but they need to show with pictures relative to the ground that it's anchored, it's got those flood resistant materials. And if there was grading or filling done, like a new road crossing, they need to show those final elevations. We do have an article about using LIDAR for some of the situations like those accessory structures, that they're clearly meeting the minimum elevations. Again, within the shoreland program, you're meeting those minimum elevations. The shoreland program is more focused on water quality and protection of the natural resources. It's just state law, whereas the FEMA regulations kick in for floodplain. And you need to meet the most restrictive. So floodway, you can't be building there. But in the shoreland areas, you'll have setback requirements, the shore impact zone, no intensive vegetation removal, a lot of other requirements. So they need to meet their shoreland setback also. And sometimes shoreland setback will be more restrictive, sometimes a floodway will be more restrictive. And again, meeting the minimum elevations in the whole shoreland district. So we just got a couple minutes left here. I'm gonna just give some highlights on flood insurance. Flood insurance, and this was a comment from the folks that lived up high on a new development that was going in next to the Mississippi River, downtown St. Paul. But who can buy flood insurance? Anybody who's in a participating community in all the flood zones. They can buy flood insurance if they choose. Some common myths you hear is, my agent told me I can only get it if I'm in a flood zone. Wrong. You can get it in all the zones as long as your community participates. We've also heard the opposite. My agent told me I can only get it if I'm not in the flood zone. Absolutely false. You can get it in all the zones, and it's going to be mandatory if you're in the flood zone and you've got a federally backed loan. Again, this is the mapped area. You're required to get flood insurance if you're in that mapped area, unless you go through a letter of map amendment process and submit information officially showing you're higher. Then you can get a waiver from that. If you're not in the mapped area, your lender won't require you to get it, but it would be advised. You know you're low. Another myth, people think their homeowner's insurance covers flooding damage. It doesn't. And you can get a rider for the sump pump failure or sewer backups on your home insurance, and that is something that flood insurance won't cover. People think, well, if there's a flood, FEMA's going to be out there handing out money to people who are damaged. That is not the case. First of all, you don't see assistance from FEMA except in the very biggest floods, when there's a presidential declaration for individual assistance, which is very rare in Minnesota. We've had that happen a couple times in the last 20 years. And when they do have that individual assistance declaration, most of the assistance is in the form of loans that must be paid back. The non-loan assistance is very minimal. It's a max of about $24,000, and the average is closer to $5,000. And we did have individual assistance in many counties last year. The average grant was about $3,500 versus the average flood insurance claim that was closer to $35,000. So, and I'm going to go through some of these more quickly. It used to be FEMA looked at, for the insurance rating, they looked at where's your lowest floor compared to the base flood elevation. Now they updated the way they rate things, and they look at the lowest adjacent grade compared to the first floor elevation. And they used to look at just what zone it was in on the map, what kind of, what the flood elevation was, what kind of foundation you had, and then the elevation of the structure if you were in the flood zone. Now they look at all kinds of other factors. And it's in this rating engine, we don't see all the data that they're using. They've got a lot of data. They look at a lot of different flood frequencies and all kinds of different factors. They will look at each building individually. The FEMA maps might just show here in this example, the Mississippi River, and they've got 500-year zones here. But when they're looking at the flood insurance ratings, they're looking at some of that other localized flood risk from the stormwater kinds of flooding you might see. And this is a clip from a Met Council localized flood map screening tool that we refer to as the blue spots. And here's a graphic showing what flood insurance covers. The green shows what's covered by the building coverage. The yellow shows the contents coverage, and the red shows things that aren't covered. Things in the basement, the stuff, most of your contents won't be covered, but it will cover furnace, water heater, and if you have contents, it'll cover washer, dryer, freezer with food. And just a warning that if you're getting the mandatory insurance, a lot of times they will just get it for the building coverage and don't advise people that you need separate contents coverage to have your contents covered. So make people aware of that if you do talk to citizens who are asking about flood insurance. We do have an updated FAQ on flood insurance, but I appreciate folks listening.